My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and until last week, I thought I had completely moved on from my father's absence. I work as a waitress in a small diner just outside Columbus, Ohio. Life hasn't exactly been glamorous, but it's honest, and I've always valued that more than money. My father, Richard Mitchell, was the opposite. A big name in real estate, he left when I was 9 and built a life without me in it. So when I got the call that he had passed, I wasn't sure how to feel. I didn't cry. I just stared out the window, wondering why he'd never come back for me. Still, something in me said I had to go to the funeral. Maybe it was closure I was after. Maybe just curiosity. I drove to the Mitchell estate, a place I'd only seen in magazines and newspaper articles. Massive gates, marble fountains, and a driveway longer than my entire street. I felt like an outsider the second I stepped out of my car. Everyone there looked like they belonged in country clubs or boardrooms. I showed up in a plain black dress and heels that pinched my toes. The stairs started before I even reached the front steps. Inside, the atmosphere was cold, not just from the air conditioning. Whispers floated behind me as I walked past people who barely acknowledged me. I caught words like illegitimate and why is she here? They didn't try to hide their contempt. Most of them probably didn't even believe I was really his daughter. My hands were trembling, but I kept my chin up. I'd faced worse. I found a seat near the back and tried to ignore the stares burning into the back of my neck. The service was formal, impersonal. A pastor read generic lines about loss and legacy, but nothing felt real. No one cried, not even his second wife, Clarissa, who sat in the front row, dry-eyed and composed like she was attending a business meeting. My father's casket sat at the center of it all, closed and polished, as silent as he'd been for most of my life. I felt something stir in my chest. Not grief, exactly. More like the weight of something unfinished. I didn't get a goodbye, just this cold, distant end. After the service, I stood alone near the back while the others gathered near the garden, sipping wine and chatting like it was a brunch event. A few people looked my way and smirked. One woman even nudged her husband and said something that made them both laugh. I clenched my jaw and looked away. I didn't come here to be ridiculed. I just wanted to honor the memory of a man who, despite everything, was still my father. That was when I saw Mr. Carlyle, my father's longtime lawyer, walking toward the patio with a folder under his arm. He tapped a glass, calling for attention. The chatter died down gradually. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and firm. "Per Mr. Mitchell's final instructions. I've been asked to read the will here today, in the presence of his family." A few raised eyebrows, but no one objected. He opened the folder and began reading. At first, it was what you'd expect. Donations to charities, property left to his wife and sons. Then he paused. "And to my daughter, Lauren Mitchell." The shift in the crowd was instant. Heads turned. Someone actually gasped. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Mr. Carlyle continued, "I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including all remaining liquid assets, the property in Aspen, and full rights to Mitchell and Cumber Holdings." A heavy silence fell over the garden. No one moved. I didn't breathe. It was as if the entire world had frozen in that moment. Clarissa's face went pale. One of my half-brothers muttered something I couldn't catch. I looked around at the stunned faces, and for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt powerful. Confused, yes, but also like something had shifted. My father hadn't just acknowledged me. He had handed me the key to everything. And judging by the reactions around me, not a single person in that room had seen it coming. As the weight of his words settled in, I stood frozen. This wasn't just about money. It was a statement, a legacy, a door being thrown wide open after decades of being shut in my face. I could feel the questions rising in the air around me, unspoken but heavy. Why me? Why now? What had my father known or done that led to this moment? I didn't have the answers, but I was about to find them. The moment the will was read, I became the center of attention, not in the way I ever wanted. As the whispers turned to raised voices, I just stood there, trying to hold myself together. Clarissa stormed away first, her heels stabbing the patio floor like gunshots. One of my half-brothers, Gregory, I think, shouted, "This is a joke, right? Some kind of mistake?" Mr. Carlyle didn't flinch. He simply shook his head and said, "Everything has been verified. Mr. Mitchell's instructions are clear. I was still trying to process what any of this meant. People began surrounding me, some with fake smiles, others with barely disguised anger. "You'll need a good lawyer," one man muttered, almost like a threat. Another, a woman who'd ignored me earlier, touched my arm and said, "You know, your father always talked about how proud he was of you." I stepped back. The sudden shift in tone from disgust to flattery made my skin crawl. None of them cared about me. They cared about what I now had. I excused myself and walked back inside the house, needing space to breathe. The study was empty, quiet and dark, with heavy curtains blocking out the sun. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my hands still shaking. I hadn't seen my father in over 20 years, and yet here I was, inheriting everything he built. It didn't make sense. He never reached out, never called. Why now? Why leave everything to me, the daughter he abandoned? The questions were louder than the voices outside. I sat down on the edge of a leather couch and stared at the fireplace, trying to make sense of a man I never truly knew. 10 minutes later, Mr. Carlyle knocked gently and stepped inside. He looked at me with something close to sympathy. "He was proud of you, Lauren, even if he never said it." I scoffed. "He never said anything." Mr. Carlyle hesitated, then handed me a sealed envelope. "He left this for you. Said you'd understand once you read it." My fingers hesitated on the flap, but curiosity won. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 weeks before his death. His handwriting was firm, exact, like everything else he did. In the letter, he apologized, not in grand words, but plainly. He admitted he was a coward, that he'd let pride and fear keep him from reaching out. He wrote about reading articles where my name popped up in local news, small features on community work, a fundraiser I once organized. He said he'd followed my life quietly, and that the success of Mitchell & Co. felt hollow without someone to share it with. "You're the only one I trust to carry this forward," he wrote. "Not because you're blood, but because you're kind, determined, and you never chased wealth." The letter left me in tears. For the first time, I saw glimpses of the father I never had. It didn't erase the years of silence, but it gave them context. Maybe guilt had driven his final decision. Maybe regret. Whatever it was, it left me with something bigger than just property or money. It gave me a purpose I hadn't expected. But I also knew this inheritance wouldn't come without a fight. The look on Gregory's face, the rage in Clarissa's eyes, they weren't going to let this go easily. And something in Carlyle's tone told me he knew that too. "I'll help you," Mr. Carlyle said as I folded the letter. "But there are things you need to know. About the company. About your father's life." I looked at him sharply. "What things?" He sighed and sat across from me. "Let's just say, not everyone in that room is angry because you inherited the company. Some are angry because now you might find out the truth behind how it all started." The way he said it made the hairs on my arms stand. Something deeper was hidden beneath the wealth and silence. I left the study feeling like the floor had shifted under my feet. Outside, most of the guests had left, but a few lingered, watching me like hawks. I walked past them without a word, got in my car, and drove back to my apartment. The silence in my little home felt surreal after the storm I'd just been through. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter still in my hand, and stared at the worn-out fridge, wondering how my life had just turned into something out of a movie. Only this wasn't fiction. This was real, and very soon, it would get even more complicated. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the company, the assets, and that cryptic warning from Mr. Carlyle. "You might find out the truth." What truth? I thought of all the times I'd been told my father had walked away, how he had chosen his new family over me. What if there was more to that story? What if the silence wasn't just absence, but protection? Or worse, shame. I wasn't just the surprise heir now. I was the new owner of a legacy that might be rotting beneath its polished surface, and I needed to know everything. The next morning, I drove to the downtown office of Mitchell & Co. with my stomach in knots. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, towering over the old brick diners and pawn shops of the surrounding block. My name was now on the deed. My father's signature had made sure of that. But as I stepped through the revolving doors, every pair of eyes turned toward me with the same blend of curiosity and suspicion. I wasn't just the new owner. I was the outsider, the intruder, and I could feel it in every stare. The receptionist, a polished young woman named Tara, stood up as I approached. "Ms. Mitchell?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Grayson is waiting for you in the executive conference room." I nodded, not entirely sure who Grayson was, but sensing I'd find out soon enough. The hallways were pristine, silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. My heels clicked loudly against the marble floors, a reminder of how out of place I still felt. But I kept walking, forcing myself not to flinch. Inside the conference room sat 3 men and a woman, all in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Carlyle stood at the end of the table, his eyes meeting mine with a slight nod. "Lauren, meet the executive board." The introductions were brief. Grayson, CFO, Patel, legal counsel, Ramirez, head of operations, and Ellen Brooks, marketing director. Each offered a handshake, but none of them smiled. Grayson, a gray-haired man with piercing eyes, leaned back in his chair. "You're here to take your father's seat, I assume." I hesitated. "I'm here to understand what I just inherited." There was a flicker of surprise in his expression, quickly masked by indifference. "Fair enough. Then let's start with the basics." What followed was a rapid-fire overview of assets, liabilities, pending acquisitions, and board dynamics. I tried to keep up, taking notes, asking questions. The company was worth over $80 million, with investments across multiple states. But what caught my attention was a brief mention of an offshore holding labeled RKM Legacy Fund. No one elaborated. After the meeting, Mr. Carlyle pulled me aside. "That fund," he said quietly, "was one of the last things your father handled personally. I suggest we look into it." His voice was low, careful, as if the walls themselves might be listening. I nodded, heart racing. Something about the way he said it told me this wasn't just business. This was personal. That night, I dug through the boxes Carlyle had given me. Documents, letters, contracts. Buried at the bottom was a keycard with a sticky note. "Storage Unit 514, Midtown Vaults." The next morning, I drove out to Midtown Vaults, a high-security storage facility my father had used for over a decade. The unit was small and meticulously organized. Inside were 3 locked drawers, a safe, and a worn leather briefcase. The briefcase held old photographs of me as a child, of my mother, of my father standing outside buildings I didn't recognize. There were letters, too, dozens of them, unsent, all addressed to me. The first one was dated the year he left. My throat tightened as I read the first few lines. He'd written to explain but never found the courage to send them. Over the years, the tone of the letters shifted, from defensive to sorrowful, from distant to desperate. One sentence stood out. "They threatened to ruin you if I didn't walk away." My blood went cold. Who was they? And what could possibly be so serious that he would abandon his own daughter to protect her? I read the letter again, trying to decipher every word. My mother had never spoken ill of him. She simply said, "He left. Let's not talk about it." Back at my apartment, I laid out the documents on my kitchen table. Photos, letters, business records. A timeline was forming, slowly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. My father hadn't just walked away. He'd been pushed. And whoever was behind that threat was likely still connected to the company. Or worse, sitting in that boardroom smiling at me yesterday. I had to find out who it was, but I'd need help. I couldn't trust anyone inside the company yet, except maybe Mr. Carlyle. That evening I called him. "We need to talk. In private," I said. He agreed immediately. We met at a quiet bar on the edge of town, where no one from the Mitchell circle would go. Over a glass of wine, I showed him the letter. His eyes darkened. "I was afraid of this," he said. "Your father made enemies when he tried to clean things up. There are things in the company's past, deals that were never supposed to come to light." I leaned in. "Then let's bring them to light. All of them." For the first time, I saw something in Carlyle's eyes. Resolve. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about justice, about truth. My father had made a decision to protect me, but now he was gone, and it was my turn to protect his legacy. I would uncover every secret, expose every lie, no matter who it hurt. And if that meant taking on powerful people with everything to lose, so be it. I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. I was Lauren Mitchell, and I was just getting started. 2 weeks later, I stood in the same boardroom, but everything had changed. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that settles in when people know something is coming, but don't yet know how bad it'll be. I had spent every day since Midtown Vaults digging, connecting names to transactions, cross-referencing documents with Mr. Carlyle. We had uncovered shell companies, illegal transfers, and contracts forged under the table, many signed by people who were now seated right in front of me. And I was ready. Grayson's voice broke the silence. "You asked for this emergency meeting, Lauren. We'd all appreciate it if you got to the point." I nodded, holding up a thick folder. "This," I said, placing it on the table, "is a full record of financial misconduct going back over 10 years. Offshore laundering, bribery, fraud, and every one of you signed off on at least one of these deals." The silence was immediate and absolute. Eyes darted around the room. Ellen shifted uncomfortably. Patel looked like he might throw up. Ramirez turned pale. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Grayson snapped, trying to sound calm. "But this is dangerous territory." I met his glare head-on. "Dangerous is what you've been doing in my father's name." I slid over copies of the letters. He knew, and he planned to go public before he got sick. Carlyle stepped forward then, placing a digital recorder on the table. He recorded every conversation, every threat, including the ones where some of you told him to stay silent, or else. Ramirez stood abruptly. "You have no proof." Carlyle pressed play. A familiar voice, Grayson's, came through the speaker. "If you expose this, Richard, your daughter will pay the price. And we both know what that means." The room exploded. Voices rose. Patel shouted. Ellen cried out, and Grayson lunged toward the recorder, only to be stopped by two men in dark suits who had entered silently minutes before. "FBI," one of them said calmly, flashing a badge. "We've been monitoring this for a week. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Mitchell." And just like that, the walls came crashing down. Hours later, I sat alone in my father's office. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows over the desk. It was finally over. Grayson, Ramirez, and the others had been taken into custody. The company was in my hands, fully, legally, and without interference. But the victory felt heavy. My father's absence, the years of silence, the pain he'd lived with, all of it settled on my chest like stone. I opened the last of his letters, the only one he'd labeled, "For the End." Inside, he wrote, "If you're reading this, you did it. I'm proud of you. Now do something better with what I built." I thought a lot about what that meant. Mitchell & Co. had been a machine for profit, status, power, but it could be more. I began restructuring from day one, cutting ties with shady partners, reinvesting in community housing, setting up scholarships in my mother's name. Some people thought I was crazy. Others said I was brave. I didn't care. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for the man who finally saw me, and for the girl I used to be, who sat by the window waiting for a father who never came. The media frenzy was overwhelming at first. Headlines called me the waitress who took down a fortune. I ignored most of it. The real work wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the late nights, the hard decisions, the awkward conversations with employees trying to trust me. Slowly, things began to change. The atmosphere in the office lightened. People started smiling more. I learned to navigate the corporate world on my own terms, firm, fair, and honest. The empire was no longer built on secrets. It was being rebuilt on something real. One afternoon, months later, I visited my father's grave. I brought no flowers, no speech, just silence. I sat on the grass, feeling the breeze, and whispered, "I forgive you." The words felt strange, but necessary. He wasn't a hero. He'd made mistakes. But in the end, he'd tried to make it right. That had to mean something. I didn't come for closure. I came to share a moment, to say goodbye in my own way, and maybe, just maybe, to feel a little less alone. Back at the office, a letter arrived addressed to me, from a woman in Chicago who claimed to have once worked with my father. She said he helped her out of a bad situation, quietly, without recognition. "He never told anyone," she wrote, "but he changed my life." I folded the letter slowly, a small smile playing on my lips. Maybe there were more stories like that out there. Maybe my father had spent his last years trying to balance the scales. And maybe now, it was my turn to continue what he started. The company thrives now, but not because of profits or market domination. It thrives because people believe in it again, because truth won, and because one woman who was laughed at during a funeral refused to walk away when things got hard. I still think about that day, about the silence that fell after the will was read. It wasn't just shock, it was the sound of power shifting, of history rewriting itself, and of a daughter reclaiming the space she was always meant to stand in.